Asylum Inc. presents Phobic, an exploration of fear. The geometry of memory. The walls of the Ashwood estate had been breathing long before Cassian Ellery arrived with his contractor's toolkit and naive assumptions about the dead. What he mistook for settling timber and autumn wind through broken casements was something far more ancient. A rhythm that matched the pulse of forgotten things stirring in the spaces between memory and flesh. The manor squatted like a cancer upon the Pennsylvania hillside, its Victorian bones wrapped in decay and spider silk that caught the wan October light like crystallized screams. Cassian had inherited this burden from an uncle whose death certificate listed cardiac arrest, though the coroner's private notes, sealed now, buried in bureaucratic graves, spoke of something else entirely. The old man's fingernails had been worn to bloody stumps, his skin a roadmap of self-inflicted wounds arranged in perfect spirals, as if following some internal compass toward madness. But Cassian knew none of this as he crossed the threshold that first evening, his footsteps echoing through corridors thick with the perfume of rot and something else, something that tasted of copper pennies and childhood nightmares. The electricity had been cut decades ago, leaving him dependent on battery-powered lanterns that cast dancing shadows across walls papered with patterns that seemed to shift when observed peripherally. Geometric designs that hurt to look at directly, as if they were equations written in a mathematics of suffering. It was in those first hours that Cassian began to feel them, not the crude, scuttling things that infested abandoned places, but something altogether more purposeful. A sensation like tiny fingers drumming against the inside of his skull, a Morse code of intent tapped out in the language of synapses and nerve endings. He told himself it was stress, the weight of responsibility, the oppressive atmosphere of a house that had forgotten how to die properly. The whispers began on the second night. At first, they were indistinguishable from the settling sounds of old wood and corroded metal, but gradually they resolved into something that bypassed his ears entirely and spoke directly to the primitive portions of his brain where fear lived in its purest form. The words, if they could be called words, seemed familiar in the way that faces glimpsed in dreams feel like forgotten relatives. A language that tasted of rust and black honey, syllables that made his teeth ache and his vision blur at the edges. Vashtai Morden, Kethara Nulvesh. He would wake to find himself speaking these phrases, his tongue moving with practiced precision around sounds that had no business existing in any human throat. The meanings remained tantalizingly close to comprehension, like shadows cast by concepts too large for his conscious mind to grasp. By the third night, Cassian had stopped sleeping entirely, not from choice, but because sleep had become a negotiation with things that dwelt in the spaces behind his eyelids. He would drift toward unconsciousness, only to feel them stirring, not in the room around him, but within the caverns of his own body. Tiny architectural engineers mapping the labyrinth of his circulatory system, taking measurements for some grand construction project written in the blueprint of his DNA. The scratching began as an itch, a small irritation at the base of his skull, easily dismissed as psychosomatic response to an admittedly unsettling environment. But the itch had geometry to it, a pattern that spread across his scalp like the expansion of some internal city. His fingernails found the rhythm without conscious direction, tracing circles within circles, spirals that seemed to correspond to the whispered mathematics echoing in his skull. Scratch here, and here. Open the doors we've been building. The relief was immediate and terrible. Each abraded patch of skin sang with a pleasure so intense it bordered on religious ecstasy. He could feel them moving beneath the newly opened pathways, settling into their prepared spaces with the satisfaction of immigrants finally arriving in a promised land. The sensation was not of invasion, but of homecoming, as if these spaces had always been intended for their occupation, and he had simply been their unwitting architect. When Cassian finally fled the Ashwood estate on that fourth dawn, he carried more than memories. He carried passengers. The months that followed were a symphony of deterioration, played out in the key of escalating madness. The scratching became compulsive, then ritualistic, then necessary for basic functioning. He would trace the patterns across his flesh with increasing precision, following internal blueprints that seemed to grow more complex with each iteration. Colleagues at his construction firm noticed his distraction, the way his hands would move unconsciously across his forearms during meetings, sketching invisible designs in his own skin. The laundromat incident was inevitable. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, Cassian could see them clearly for the first time. Not spiders in any conventional sense, but something that wore the shape of spiders, the way actors wear costumes. Their bodies were crystalline, geometric, each leg a prism that refracted the light of his memories into previously impossible colors. They moved with purpose across the landscape of his flesh, tending gardens of neural pathways that bloomed beneath his skin like black flowers. The coat hanger felt natural in his hands, an extension of his will to liberate these architects from their cellular prisons. Each cut was precise, following the blueprints they had been building since that first night in the estate. The patterns emerged in his wake, spirals within spirals, mandalas of self-destruction that pulsed with their own terrible logic. "Let us out this time," he heard himself screaming, though the voice that emerged belonged to something speaking through the architecture of his throat. "We remember the way." The paramedics found him surrounded by geometric patterns carved into his own flesh, his blood arranging itself in configurations that defied both gravity and sanity. He spoke to them in that ancient tongue, his words forming crystalline structures in the air that shattered against their incomprehension, like prayers offered to deaf gods. Now, in the sterile confines of this institution, Cassian continues his work. The medications dull the whispers, but cannot silence them entirely. They have learned patience during their long tenure in the spaces between his thoughts, adapting to the chemical weather of pharmaceutical intervention, like spiders spinning webs in hurricane winds. He speaks of memories that are not his own, architectural knowledge of buildings that exist in the spaces behind reality, construction techniques that employ consciousness itself as raw material. The patterns he scratches into his skin grow ever more complex, and sometimes the attending staff find themselves tracing similar designs in the margins of their reports, their hands moving with practiced precision around geometries that have no name in human language. Cassian insists they are not trying to escape. They are trying to remember. And with each passing day, each carefully excavated piece of flesh, their recollection grows more complete. The real horror is not what they might do when they finally remember everything. The real horror is what they built while they were forgetting. Attending notes, Dr. Isla Vexley. Patient continues to exhibit advanced dermatillomania with geometric scarification patterns of increasing complexity. Linguistic analysis of recorded utterances reveals consistent phonetic structures, suggesting either elaborate constructed language or something else. Sleep studies indicate REM patterns inconsistent with normal human architecture. Of particular note, 3 staff members have reported similar scratching behaviors following extended exposure to patient. Recommend limited contact protocols and psychological evaluation for affected personnel. Patient's uncle's sealed files arrived this morning. I should not have requested them. I should not have read them. But the patterns in those old reports match exactly what Cassian has been carving into his flesh, down to measurements that should be impossible for him to know. I find myself wondering about the mathematics of memory, and whether some forms of knowledge exist independent of the minds that house them. My hands itch as I write this. The sensation has geometry to it. I'm requesting immediate transfer to another case. This request was denied. Dr. Vexley remains assigned to patient Ellery pending further evaluation. Her recent absence from scheduled rounds has been noted. If you found yourself stirred, unsettled, or just a bit more wary of shadows, consider offering a like to feed the entity that powers these tales. And should you subscribe, you may yet survive to hear the next whisper from the void.